On March 26, 1945, General George Patton sat in his headquarters and made a decision that would haunt his legacy forever. His Third Army had just crossed the Rhine River and was racing across Germany. The war would be over in weeks. Victory was certain, but Patton was not thinking about victory. He was thinking about his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, who was sitting in a German prisoner of war camp 60 miles behind enemy lines. That same evening, in a cramped briefing room, a 24-year-old captain named Abraham Baum received orders that made no military sense. He was to take 300 men, punch through German territory, reach a camp called Hammelburg, and bring back the prisoners. His commanders told him the mission was suicidal. They told him the force was too small. They told him he would not make it back. Baum went anyway. What happened over the next 48 hours would become the most controversial decision of Patton's career. It would cost the lives of American soldiers. It would destroy an entire task force. And it would expose a truth that Patton spent the rest of his life trying to hide. The story begins not in Germany, but in Tunisia, more than 2 years earlier. On February 14, 1943, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched Operation Frühlingswind against American positions near Sidi Bouzid. The attack caught the Americans completely off guard. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been fighting in the desert for 2 years. They knew the terrain. They knew the tactics. The Americans they faced had never been in combat before. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters commanded a battalion of the 1st Armoured Division positioned on a rise called Jebel Lesouda. When the German attack began at 4 in the morning, Waters found himself cut off from friendly forces. German panzers swept across the desert floor, encircling the isolated American positions like predators surrounding prey. American counterattacks failed disastrously. Tanks sent to relieve Waters drove straight into German ambushes and were destroyed. For 3 days, Waters and his men held their hilltop as German forces tightened the ring around them. They had limited water, limited ammunition, and no prospect of relief. On February 17th, with supplies exhausted and German tanks closing in, Waters attempted a breakout. The escape failed. German forces captured Waters and roughly 300 of his men. The defeat at Sidi Bouzid was part of the larger disaster at Kasserine Pass, the worst American defeat of the North African campaign. American forces lost over 6,000 men in the fighting. The Germans mocked the inexperienced American troops and predicted they would never become effective soldiers. But Waters was not just any American officer captured in that debacle. He had graduated from West Point in 1931. On June 27, 1934, he had married Beatrice Eyre Patton, the eldest daughter of George Patton, at St. John's Church in Beverly Farms, Massachusetts. The prisoner the Germans had captured was one of the most famous generals in the American Army's son-in-law. For the next 25 months, Waters moved through the German prisoner of war system. He was held first at camps in Italy, then transferred to Oflag 64 in Zubin, Poland. Oflag was short for Offizierslager, meaning officers' camp. The Germans separated officer prisoners from enlisted men, housing them in different facilities under different conditions. Waters became a leader among the prisoners. He organized resistance activities. He maintained military discipline despite the degrading conditions of captivity. He kept men focused on survival and eventual liberation while the war raged somewhere beyond the barbed wire. He did not know when rescue would come. He only knew that his duty was to bring as many men home as possible. In January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced westward through Poland, the Germans evacuated Oflag 64. The prisoners were given almost no warning. Waters and roughly 1,300 American officers were roused from their bunks in the freezing darkness and told to march west. The winter march lasted 7 weeks. The column trudged 340 miles through snow and ice, sleeping in barns and fields, surviving on whatever scraps the Germans provided. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Men died from exposure. The prisoners who could not keep up were left behind. Those who complained were beaten. The survivors who finally reached Germany in early March were barely recognizable as the officers who had departed Poland. Waters arrived at Oflag 13B near Hammelburg on March 9, 1945. The camp sat 3 kilometers south of the town in the Bavarian countryside, within a larger German military training complex that had been established in 1893. Stone barracks that had once housed German soldiers now held prisoners from across the Allied nations. The conditions at Hammelburg were grim. An International Red Cross inspection conducted on March 25th documented daily rations of just over 1,000 calories per day, less than half what a man needed to maintain health. 7 antiquated stone barracks each crammed 200 men into 5 rooms. Average indoor temperatures reached only 20 degrees Fahrenheit because fuel shortages allowed just 48 coal briquettes per stove every 3 days. Many prisoners had lost more than 50 pounds since their capture. Dysentery was widespread. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. The men who had survived the winter march arrived at Hammelburg already weakened. The camp's conditions only made them weaker. The prisoner population was larger and more diverse than American intelligence realized. In addition to the 1,300 Americans who had arrived with Waters, the camp held several thousand Serbian officers who had been imprisoned since 1941. These Yugoslavs had been prisoners for nearly 4 years. They knew the routines of captivity better than anyone. Waters had no idea that his father-in-law's army was only 60 miles away. He had no idea that within 17 days, American tanks would come crashing through the camp's fences, and he had no idea that the rescue attempt would nearly kill him. Patton learned of Waters' location in early March. 3 American prisoners had escaped during the winter march and made their way east to Soviet lines. Eventually, they reached the United States military mission in Moscow. Major General John Dean forwarded intelligence to General Eisenhower, identifying Waters among prisoners heading to Hammelburg. Eisenhower sent this information to Patton. The evidence of what happened next comes from Patton's own hand. His letters to his wife Beatrice, preserved in the Patton papers and published decades after his death, prove beyond doubt that rescuing Waters was a primary motivation for the raid. On March 23, 1945, Patton wrote to Beatrice, "We are heading right for John's place and may get there before he is moved." 2 days later, on March the 25th, he wrote again, "Hope to send an expedition tomorrow to get John." On March 27th, the day after the raid departed, he wrote once more, "Last night I sent a column to a place where John and some 900 prisoners are said to be. I have been nervous as a cat, as everyone but me thought it too great a risk." These were not the words of a general conducting a tactical diversion. These were the words of a father-in-law trying to rescue family. Everything Patton said publicly about the raid was a lie. The military situation in late March 1945 made the raid even more questionable. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on March 22nd in one of the war's most dramatic river crossings. The 12th Corps, under Major General Manton Eddy, was pushing northeast toward the main river. The German army was collapsing across the entire Western Front. Organized resistance was crumbling faster than anyone had predicted. The war in Europe would end in 6 weeks. This meant that Hammelburg, like every other German prisoner of war camp, would be liberated by conventional forces within days or weeks at most. There was no urgent military necessity to send a small task force deep into German-held territory. The prisoners were not in immediate danger of execution. They were not being moved to an unknown location. They simply had to wait for the Allied advance to reach them, which it inevitably would. Patton knew this. His commanders knew this. Everyone involved in planning the raid knew that patience would achieve the same result without risking American lives. But Patton was not a patient man. He had never been a patient man. And the prisoner at Hammelburg was not just any prisoner. On the night of March 25th, Patton summoned Major General Eddy to his headquarters. He ordered Eddy to organize a task force to penetrate deep into German territory and liberate the prisoner of war camp at Hammelburg. Eddy was shocked. The mission violated every principle of concentration that governed military operations. His corps was advancing north toward the Ruhr pocket, where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers would soon be encircled. Sending forces east, away from the main axis of advance, would weaken his combat power for no tactical benefit. The task force would be operating beyond the range of artillery support. It would be beyond the range of air support. It would be completely on its own, 60 miles deep in enemy territory. Eddy argued against the mission. He warned Patton that the force would be too small to fight its way through German defences and back again. He warned that the task force would be cut off from resupply and reinforcement from the moment it departed. He warned that if the mission failed, Patton would face severe criticism for sending men on what amounted to a suicide mission. Patton dismissed every objection. The argument continued down the chain of command. Brigadier General William Hoge, who had just taken command of the 4th Armoured Division, objected strenuously. His division needed rest and refitting after the grueling Rhine crossing. The tanks needed maintenance. The men needed sleep. Sending a force into enemy territory at this moment was operationally questionable. Hoge recommended that if the mission had to proceed, it should be assigned a full combat command with adequate tanks, infantry, artillery, and supporting elements. A combat command comprised approximately 4,000 men with the firepower and logistical capacity for sustained independent operations. That kind of force had a chance of fighting through German defences and returning with prisoners. A smaller force did not. Lieutenant Colonel Captain Abraham, commander of Combat Command B, went further. Abrams would later become one of the most famous tank commanders of the war and eventually Army Chief of Staff. He understood armoured warfare better than almost anyone in the European theatre. When Patton asked who would command the task force, Abrams stepped forward. "I am going to command it," Abrams said, "and I want to take Combat Command B." Abrams argued that his combat command could go anywhere and fight through any opposition it encountered. "Give me my full command," he insisted, "and I will bring those prisoners back." Patton refused. "This is to be a small force," he said. "Now answer my question. Who is going to lead it?" The logic of using a small force never made sense to the professionals who examined it. A combat command had the mass to punch through German blocking positions. A combat command had the firepower to suppress enemy defences. A combat command had the vehicles to transport hundreds of prisoners. The force Patton authorized had none of these capabilities. Roughly 300 men, no artillery, no air support, barely enough fuel for the round trip, with almost no margin for combat or delay. If the mission required fighting through serious opposition, the task force would be destroyed. Everyone in the room knew it, except, apparently, Patton. Historians have debated why Patton insisted on limiting the force. Some argue he wanted to minimize losses if the mission failed. Others suggest he wanted to minimize attention, hoping a small raid would escape notice. The most likely explanation is that Patton wanted to rescue his son-in-law without it looking like he was rescuing his son-in-law. A full combat command assault on a prisoner of war camp would attract attention and questions. A small reconnaissance in force might slip under the radar. If that was his calculation, it was badly wrong. The man chosen to lead the doomed mission was Captain Abraham Baum. He was 24 years old, born in the Bronx on March 29, 1921, the son of a Russian Jewish immigrant. Before the war, Baum had worked as a pattern maker in the New York garment industry. He had enlisted on December 27, 1941, 20 days after Pearl Harbor, without finishing high school. By March 1945, Baum was the operations officer of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion. He had fought across France and through the Battle of the Bulge. His body still carried more than 40 pieces of shrapnel from stepping on a German bouncing mine near the Maginot Line. He was tough, he was competent, he was experienced, and he was completely expendable in the eyes of the generals planning the mission. Baum was not the first choice to lead the raid. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Cohen, commander of the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion, had been selected initially by Abrams, but Patton, in characteristic fashion, personally inspected Cohen's medical condition. Cohen claimed to have hemorrhoids that would prevent him from sitting in a vehicle for the extended mission. Patton examined him and declared him unfit. Some witnesses believed Patton doubted whether Cohen, who was Jewish like Baum, actually had the condition he claimed. Patton was known for making anti-Semitic remarks. Whatever his reasoning, he rejected Cohen and demanded another officer. Cohen pointed to Baum standing nearby. Patton accepted the substitution without hesitation. At 5 in the afternoon on March 26th, Baum assembled his task force. He had been given only hours to prepare for a mission that should have taken days to plan. He had 10 M4 Sherman medium tanks, 6 M5 Stuart light tanks, 3 105mm assault guns, 27 half-tracks, and 6 jeeps. The total force numbered approximately 307 men. They carried enough fuel and ammunition for a 60-mile penetration and return, with almost no margin for error. Patton visited the task force before departure. He walked among the vehicles, speaking briefly with officers and men. He allegedly promised Baum the Medal of Honor if the mission succeeded. Baum's response became famous among those who survived the raid. "I have my orders, sir," Baum said. "You do not have to bribe me." What Patton did not tell Baum was the real purpose of the mission. Baum believed he was liberating a camp holding roughly 300 American prisoners. He had no idea that over 1,400 Americans were held at Hammelburg, along with several thousand Serbian officers who had been imprisoned since 1941. He had no idea that his task force was expected to bring back nearly 5 times more prisoners than he had vehicles to carry. The truth emerged at 11 that night, hours after the mission departed. Major Alexander Stiller, Patton's personal aide and a former Texas Ranger who had served with Patton in the First World War, had volunteered to accompany the task force. Stiller was Patton's factotum and bodyguard, a man who had been with him for decades. His presence on a combat mission was unusual. During a delay in the advance, Baum asked Stiller why Patton was so determined to reach this particular camp. Why had the general visited personally before departure? Why was his personal aide riding along? What was so special about Hammelburg? Stiller admitted that Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General Patton's son-in-law, was among the prisoners. A cold fury washed over Baum. He had been sent on a suicide mission to rescue a general's relative. His men were risking their lives not for military necessity but for family obligation. Everything he had been told about the strategic importance of the mission was incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. But Baum was a soldier. He had his orders. The column was already miles behind enemy lines. There was nothing to do but continue forward and hope for the best. He continued the mission, The task force departed the American lines at 9 in the evening following a 30-minute artillery barrage on the town of Schweinheim. The supporting attack was supposed to open a corridor for the task force to slip through German defences. Instead, the German 413th Infantry Division put up fierce resistance that no one had anticipated. House-to-house fighting erupted in Schweinheim. American infantry and tanks engaged German defenders at close range, while the task force waited for the route to clear. The delay stretched for hours. Baum had expected to push through quickly and race toward Hammelburg under cover of darkness. Instead, the task force sat exposed, while the element of surprise evaporated. The column did not clear Schweinheim until after midnight. By then, German commanders along the route knew American armor was operating behind their lines. Telephone calls went out to every garrison and blocking position. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Through the early morning hours of March 27th, the task force raced eastward along roads that twisted through the German countryside. Near Lohr, they surprised a German convoy and destroyed 12 vehicles without stopping. Speed was everything now. They could not afford to engage every enemy force they encountered. At Gemünden am Main, everything went wrong. The town sat at the confluence of rivers and rail lines, a natural choke point defended by German forces. More importantly, it was a major assembly area for German infantry units moving toward the front. The task force had blundered into an enemy concentration they had not expected. German engineers blew the main bridge as the first American vehicles attempted to cross. 2 soldiers were killed on the bridge when it detonated. In the fighting that followed, German rockets and anti-tank weapons tore into the American column. Baum was wounded in the hand but refused evacuation. The task force lost several vehicles and suffered significant casualties before breaking through. A German reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead and began circling the column. Whatever element of surprise still remained was now completely gone. German headquarters tracked the American force as it pushed deeper into their territory. Officers studied maps and calculated intercept points. Blocking forces moved into position along every possible route of withdrawal. The task force reached Oflag 13B during the mid-afternoon of March 27th. They had been moving and fighting continuously for over 18 hours. Roughly half the original force remained combat effective. Fuel was running low. Ammunition was running low. They were deep in enemy territory with no prospect of reinforcement and an enemy that now knew exactly where they were. Approaching the camp, the column was ambushed by German tank destroyers. These were Hetzers, small but deadly armoured vehicles mounting powerful 75mm guns, positioned in a classic ambush configuration along the route to the camp. The Hetzer was designed specifically for defensive operations, low to the ground and hard to spot until it opened fire. The engagement lasted several brutal minutes. The German gunners destroyed 2 Sherman tanks, 1 Stuart light tank, 5 half-tracks, and a jeep before withdrawing. The task force had not yet reached the camp and had already lost a quarter of its remaining combat power. Baum ordered his surviving tanks to charge the camp perimeter. There was no time for careful reconnaissance. There was no time for coordinated assault planning. The force crashed through the outer defences and began engaging the German garrison directly. For approximately 2 hours, American vehicles fought the camp guards. Tanks knocked down sections of the perimeter fence. Machine guns targeted guard towers, where German soldiers were firing down at the attackers. Some guards fled into the surrounding woods. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Some fought back with rifles and grenades until they were killed. Inside the camp, the American prisoners watched in astonishment as Sherman tanks crashed through the wire. They had heard distant artillery fire for days. They had seen Allied aircraft passing overhead. They knew the front was approaching, but no one had told them rescue was coming today. Colonel Paul Good, the senior American officer, tried to maintain order as chaos erupted throughout the compound. Men who had been prisoners for months or years suddenly saw American tanks bearing down on the fences. The elation was overwhelming. The confusion was total. Then the shooting stopped. German Camp Commandant General Major Gunther von Goeckel decided further resistance was pointless. His guards were outgunned. The Americans had armor. He had nothing that could stop them. He decided to surrender the camp and asked Lieutenant Colonel Waters, as one of the senior American officers who spoke German, to negotiate a truce with the attacking force. Waters assembled a small party carrying a white flag. He walked out of the camp accompanied by several American officers and one German officer to make contact with the task force. After 25 months as a prisoner, he was finally going to meet his rescuers. He had no idea that his father-in-law had sent them specifically for him. What happened next would determine the entire outcome of the mission. A German soldier in camouflage uniform was positioned along the route Waters walked. This soldier had not been informed of the surrender arrangement. He had been fighting Americans for hours. He saw figures approaching through the smoke and confusion. He did not see the white flag, or did not care. He steadied his rifle atop a fence post. He fired. The bullet struck Waters in the right hip and exited through his left buttock, passing dangerously close to his spine. He collapsed immediately into the dirt, bleeding heavily, unable to move. The man Patton had sent over 300 soldiers to rescue lay wounded in the open, unable to walk, unable to be evacuated. Major Stiller ran through the camp searching for Waters. When he finally found him, he saw immediately that evacuation was impossible. Waters was too badly wounded to travel. Moving him over 60 miles of rough roads with German forces in pursuit would almost certainly kill him. The mission's primary objective had failed at the moment of apparent success. The rescue force had reached the camp. They had defeated the garrison. They had found Waters, and they could not save him. Colonel Radovan Danik, chief surgeon of the former Yugoslav army and a Serbian prisoner at the camp for nearly 4 years, performed emergency surgery on Waters. Danik had kept his medical skills sharp, treating prisoners throughout his captivity. He operated with whatever instruments and supplies he could scavenge. The surgery saved Waters' life. But Waters could not be moved from the camp hospital. Baum now faced an impossible calculation. His remaining vehicles could transport perhaps 200 men at most, but over 1,400 American prisoners wanted evacuation. The task force had been told to expect 300 prisoners. They found nearly 5 times that number, plus thousands of Serbian officers who also begged for liberation. There were not enough vehicles. There were not enough seats. There was not enough fuel to carry everyone back to American lines, even if they could find room. Baum had to choose who would ride and who would stay. He announced that only field-grade officers, majors, and above could ride in vehicles. Everyone else would have to walk the 60 miles back to American lines on foot. Many prisoners, weakened by months of malnutrition and the brutal winter march from Poland, knew they could not make that journey. Many calculated that liberation by conventional forces was probably only days away. Many decided their odds were better staying at the camp than attempting the impossible trek. The task force departed Hammelburg at approximately 8 in the evening, with perhaps 200 prisoners crammed aboard the remaining vehicles. Behind them, they left Waters lying in the camp hospital, too badly wounded to travel. Behind them, they left over 1,000 American prisoners who would wait 9 more days for liberation. The retreat became a nightmare from the first mile. The task force moved through the darkness on unfamiliar roads, guided by maps that showed none of the small villages and forest tracks they encountered. Tanks occasionally shut down their engines entirely, listening for sounds of German movement. The moonless night was both blessing and curse, hiding the column but also making navigation nearly impossible. Near the village of Holrich, veteran non-commissioned officers from a German infantry training school had established an ambush. Nearly 100 experienced sergeants, men who trained others in combat tactics, waited in the darkness with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. When the lead Sherman tank appeared, they opened fire. The first rocket destroyed the tank completely. The crew never had a chance to react. But what happened next demonstrated the desperation and ingenuity of the German defense. A German soldier ran to the destroyed Sherman and discovered the engine was still running. The driver had been killed before he could shut it down. The soldier climbed into the vehicle, figured out the controls, and drove it off the road into a position where it could ambush other American vehicles, approaching from behind. Meanwhile, another German soldier who spoke English began answering radio calls from other tanks in the column. He pretended to be an American tanker, giving directions and status reports designed to lure the following vehicles into the kill zone. 4 more Sherman tanks were destroyed using the captured tank and deceptive radio calls before the Americans realized what was happening. The ambush broke the back of Task Force Baum. The survivors scattered into the darkness, no longer a coherent military unit, but small groups of men trying to survive. The remnants of the task force retreated to Hill 427, a rise called Rosenberg, arriving in the early morning hours of March 28th. They had no fuel to continue. They had no ammunition for sustained combat. They had no hope of reaching American lines 50 miles away. They could only wait for dawn and pray for a miracle. Colonel Good, who had accompanied the task force from the camp, made a difficult decision. He would return to Hammelburg with the walking wounded rather than slow the remaining mobile forces. It was a calculation of survival. The wounded could not walk 50 miles. They would die trying. They might live if they surrendered and received medical care. Good led his group back toward the camp as the sky began to lighten. Behind him, Baum prepared for a final stand that everyone knew was hopeless. Shortly after dawn, Baum ordered the column to move out. German forces had surrounded the hill during the night. There was no gap in the encirclement. There was no path to safety. When the Americans emerged from cover, fire erupted from every direction. German artillery, small arms, and anti-tank weapons converged on the American position. The battle lasted perhaps 25 minutes. German assault guns fired point blank into American vehicles. Infantry closed in from all sides. One by one, the remaining tanks and half-tracks were destroyed or disabled. Baum shouted the only order left to give. Every man for himself. Scatter. Run. Try to survive. The soldiers of Task Force Baum abandoned their burning vehicles and fled into the surrounding woods. German infantry with tracking dogs pursued them through the forest. Most were captured within hours. A few evaded the search parties and began the long walk toward American lines. Baum escaped into the woods with 2 other soldiers. Because he was Jewish, he discarded his dog tags as he ran. He knew what German forces sometimes did to captured Jews. He had heard rumors of the concentration camps. Though the full horror was not yet known, he would take his chances as an anonymous prisoner rather than identify himself as a Jew. A German soldier spotted Baum trying to flee and shot him in the groin. Captured by Volkssturm Home Guard militia, Baum was taken to the camp hospital at Hammelburg, the same hospital where Waters lay recovering from surgery. Colonel Danik, the Serbian surgeon who had saved Waters the day before, now operated on Baum. The 2 men, the general's son-in-law and the captain sent to rescue him, were placed in adjacent hospital beds. They had never met before the raid. They had been connected only by Patton's secret purpose. Now they lay side by side, both wounded, both prisoners, both failed by the mission that was supposed to save them. They would become lifelong friends. The cost of Task Force Baum was complete and total. Of approximately 307 men who departed on March 26th, 32 were killed in action. Nearly 250 were wounded or captured. Only 35 made it back to American lines, most of them by evading capture and walking for days through German territory. Every single vehicle was destroyed or captured. 10 Sherman tanks, 6 Stuart light tanks, had 27 half-tracks, 3 assault guns, 6 jeeps, 100% losses. The prisoners at Hammelburg, the men the mission was supposed to rescue, remained in German hands. 9 days later, on April 6, 1945, Combat Command B of the 14th Armoured Division, part of 7th Army, liberated the camp during a routine advance. The 14th Armoured Division was not under Patton's command. The 3rd Army, which had launched the failed rescue, was nowhere nearby. The liberation that Patton had risked 300 lives to accelerate came anyway, achieved by different forces using overwhelming strength rather than a desperate gamble. Every man who died on Task Force Baum died for nothing. The camp would have been freed regardless. Waters survived his wound. The bullet that struck him down may have saved his life. After the raid failed, able-bodied prisoners at Hammelburg were force-marched deeper into Germany ahead of the Allied advance. Waters, too badly wounded to travel, remained at the camp hospital and was liberated with the other patients when the 14th Armoured Division arrived. He went on to a distinguished career after the war. He served as Commandant of Cadets at West Point. He commanded the 4th Armoured Division and 5th Corps in Europe. He rose to become Commander of United States Army Pacific. He retired on August 31, 1966, as a 4-star general. He died on January 9, 1989, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Baum received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Hammelburg, not the Medal of Honor that Patton had promised. The Medal of Honor required a formal investigation into the circumstances of the action, and Patton wanted no investigation that might expose his true motivations. An investigation would require testimony from the officers who had objected to the mission. It would require examination of the intelligence that had been provided or withheld. It would require answers to uncomfortable questions about why the general's son-in-law happened to be at the camp that was selected for rescue. The Distinguished Service Cross could be awarded on the recommendation of the commanding general alone, with no inconvenient questions asked. After the war, Baum returned to the garment industry. He founded the Major Blouse Company in Manhattan and built a successful business. In 1948, he traveled to the newly established State of Israel, where he trained tank battalions and advised military leaders, including Moshe Dayan. He never forgot Hammelburg, but he never expressed public bitterness about it either. When asked about the raid decades later, Baum's response captured the soldiers' philosophy. "They gave me something to do, and I did it." He harbored no grudge against Patton that he ever voiced publicly. He maintained his friendship with Waters for the rest of their lives. He lived to 91 years old, dying on March 3, 2013, at his home in Rancho Bernardo, California. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Patton's public explanation for the raid shifted repeatedly in the days and weeks that followed. He offered multiple versions to different audiences, none of them truthful. At a press conference on March 30, 1945, he claimed the mission was a tactical diversion. "I felt by hazarding a small force I would confuse the enemy completely as to where we were going," he said. "It did work, for they thought I was going to Nuremberg." This explanation convinced no one who understood military operations. A task force of 300 men operating far behind the front could not possibly constitute a meaningful strategic diversion. The German High Command was not confused about Patton's intentions. They tracked the task force ambushed it, and destroyed it, while the Third Army continued its actual advance in a completely different direction. In his diary entry of March 31st, 1945, Patton offered a different explanation. He blamed General Omar Bradley for limiting the force. "I made it with only 2 companies, on account of the strenuous objections of General Bradley to making any effort at all," he wrote. "Had I sent a combat command, as I had first intended to do, this mistake would not have occurred." Bradley later denied approving any raid on Hammelburg. He said he would have forbidden the mission entirely if Patton had consulted him properly. The truth of their conversation remains disputed by historians, but the outcome is clear. Patton sent an inadequate force on an impossible mission and blamed others when it failed. The letters to his wife tell a different story than any of his public statements. "We are heading right for John's place. Hope to send an expedition tomorrow to get John. I have been nervous as a cat." These were not the words of a general conducting a tactical diversion. These were the words of a father-in-law desperate to rescue family. General Eisenhower learned the details of the raid in mid-April. In a letter to General Marshall on April 15th, 1945, he described it as one of Patton's latest crackpot actions. He sent off a little expedition on a wild goose chase in an effort to liberate some American prisoners, Eisenhower wrote. The upshot was that he got 25 prisoners back and lost a full company of medium tanks and a platoon of light tanks. Eisenhower's casualty figures were wrong because Patton had minimized the disaster in his reports to higher headquarters. The actual losses were far worse than Eisenhower understood, but the assessment was accurate. The raid was a wild goose chase. It accomplished nothing except getting American soldiers killed. General Bradley later wrote that Hammelburg was a story that began as a wild goose chase and ended in tragedy. He added that he did not formally rebuke Patton for the disaster. Failure itself was George's own worst reprimand. The mission was classified secret from its inception. Within a year of Patton's death in an automobile accident in December 1945, the classification was upgraded to top secret. The full story did not emerge for decades, gradually revealed through Martin Blumensen's publication of the Patton Papers in 1974 and Richard Barron's book Raid, co-authored with Baum himself in 1981. Military historians who have studied the raid have reached near unanimous consensus on its meaning. It was the least defensible decision Patton ever made. Carlo d'Este, author of a major Patton biography, wrote that Hammelburg has become an enduring stain on his reputation. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Kitchen, in an Army battle analysis published in 2018, concluded that if Patton's real motivation was to rescue Waters, he egregiously abused his command authority and needlessly risked the lives of his soldiers. Historian Martin Blumensen, who edited the Patton Papers, documented that Patton had followed news of the Cabanatuan raid in the Philippines with intense interest. When General Douglas MacArthur's forces successfully rescued over 500 prisoners in a brilliantly planned operation, Patton reportedly said he intended to take action that would make MacArthur look like a piker. If true, the statement reveals the competitive vanity that may have driven him toward disaster. Patton wanted a dramatic rescue to rival MacArthur's success. Instead, he produced a catastrophe that military schools still study as an example of what happens when ego overrides judgment. The contrast with that other prisoner rescue mission is instructive. On January 30th, 1945, just 2 months before Hammelburg, Army Rangers conducted the raid on the Cabanatuan prison camp in the Philippines. That mission rescued over 500 American prisoners, while suffering only 2 killed and 4 wounded. The difference was not courage. Baum's men fought with extraordinary bravery against impossible odds. The difference was planning, resources, and honest purpose. The Cabanatuan raiders spent 2 days on detailed reconnaissance before the assault. They had accurate intelligence on enemy strength and prisoner locations. They received support from Filipino guerrillas who knew the terrain. They had air cover to distract Japanese defenders. They had a coherent plan for extracting the prisoners once the camp was secured. Hammelburg had 4 hours of planning instead of 2 days. It had no reconnaissance of the route or objective. It had wildly inaccurate intelligence about prisoner numbers. It had no air support. It had no local assistance. It had no realistic plan for extracting 1,400 prisoners with vehicles that could carry 200. The mission was designed to fail from the moment it was conceived. When Patton visited Baum in the hospital after the raid, he pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on the captain's pajamas. The two men had a brief exchange that revealed everything about the deception at the heart of the mission. "You know, sir," Baum said, "it is difficult for me to believe that you would have sent us on that mission just to rescue one man." "That is right, Abe," Patton replied. "I would not." Witnesses reported that Patton visibly relaxed after this exchange. He believed Baum had accepted the official cover story. The general and the captain then argued amiably about tank tactics for the next hour, as if 300 soldiers had not been sacrificed in a mission that never should have been ordered. No formal military investigation was ever conducted into the Hammelburg raid. Patton classified the mission to prevent scrutiny. His death 8 months later foreclosed any subsequent inquiry. The men who died at Hammelburg died without accountability. The man who sent them there was never held responsible for his decision. The story of Task Force Baum matters because it shows what happens when personal interest corrupts military judgment. Every officer in Patton's chain of command objected to the mission. Every professional assessment concluded the force was too small for the objective. Every principle of sound military planning was violated, and still the order went forward because the man giving it would not be told no. Patton was one of the most effective combat commanders of the Second World War. His drive across France after D-Day remains a masterpiece of mobile warfare. His relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge saved the surrounded defenders and turned the tide of the German offensive. These achievements were real and significant, but greatness in one domain does not excuse failure in another. The same aggressiveness that made Patton effective in battle made him reckless when personal considerations clouded his judgment. He had slapped shell-shocked soldiers in Sicily because he could not accept that brave men could break under stress. He sent Task Force Baum to Hammelburg because he could not accept waiting for conventional forces to free his daughter's husband. The men of Task Force Baum did not volunteer for a family rescue mission. They were soldiers ordered to perform an assignment by generals they trusted. They did not know they were being sent to rescue Patton's relative. They did not know the force had been designed too small to succeed. They followed orders because that is what soldiers do. Their courage deserves to be remembered. They fought through German defenses for 18 hours straight. They stormed a prisoner of war camp defended by armed guards. They held their ground against ambushes that destroyed their vehicles one by one. When the end came, on Hill 4's 27, they scattered into the woods and tried to walk 50 miles to freedom. 32 of them never came home. They died in a foreign country, fighting a battle that did not need to be fought, because a general could not wait for the war to take its natural course. Their names are not famous. Their sacrifice is barely remembered outside military history circles. They deserved better from the commanders who sent them to die. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The lessons of Hammelburg echo across the decades. Power creates temptation. Authority enables abuse. The qualities that make leaders effective can make them dangerous when unchecked by accountability. The soldiers of Task Force Baum trusted their chain of command to spend their lives wisely. That trust was betrayed by a general who valued his family connection more than their survival. History remembers the generals. It should also remember the soldiers who paid for their decisions.